All right, let's go ahead and get started then. Everybody, thanks for joining the second webinar of our Agile UX Masterclass series. We're here today with Nate Ginesi, who's a senior UX architect at LookThink. And today the topic, as you can probably see on the screen, is going to be about Agile prototyping best practices. And just to recap, the format will be his presentation, roughly 40 to 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have about 20 minutes of Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, there's a Q&A box down at the bottom that you can type all your questions to, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. Afterwards, Nate will also be in our Product Tribe Slack channel to answer further questions you may have. Otherwise, Nate, I'll kind of hand it over to you.
Hi guys, welcome to Agile Prototyping Best Practices. So before we get started, I want to put a thank you out there to Jerry and his team at UXPin for giving me the opportunity to talk to you all today, and want to thank you guys all for being here. Looks like over 500, pushing 600 people, so that's awesome. I'm super happy and excited to be here with you guys. Hopefully you can all take something away from this presentation, come away from it with a little something to help your teams along with your prototyping processes. So a little about me. My name is Nate Ginesi, and I'm a senior user experience architect at LookThink. My background is in visual design and marketing, and I've been designing and building interfaces for a little over 10 years now. Majority of that time has been with LookThink. And LookThink is a full-service user experience agency based in Washington, D.C. We're about 22 people now. And we focus mainly on B2B enterprise product design. Our clients vary from your next door neighbor startup to the US government. The scope and scale of our projects is kind of all over the place. On any given day, we'll be working on anything from a small scale application to enterprise level cloud-based software systems, Salesforce customizations, B2B websites, e-commerce solutions. So we see a lot of different stuff. Because we see a lot of different stuff, we see a broad spectrum of budgets, complexities, and timelines, and we have to deal with a lot of variables in each project that comes through the door. So we often then also jump into projects at varying places along the process. So sometimes it's at the very beginning, and sometimes we come in just for the design piece, and then sometimes we come in at the very end to just kind of triage and run damage control. And because of that, we see a wide variety of scopes and situations that we have learned from and we've used to help us derive our process. And since no two projects are really the same for us, we've really had to work to find commonalities across projects that can help us be efficient and agile. So as you've probably figured out by the virtue of me being here talking to you, our team uses UXPin as its primary prototyping tool. Between all the members on the team, I think we've tried just about everything else. And we ultimately wound up here at UXPin, mainly because it was the best fit, and it took us a while to figure out exactly what our company needed. And I think it's partially a testament to the great product that they've built over there at UXPin, but also through a lot of failures and shortcomings of our own as a company along the way. So getting to that point where we realized what we actually need took us some time. So today I'm going to explain to you how prototyping has helped our Agile process and provide you with some best practices that we've learned along the way. These best practices can hopefully be adopted and or adapted by your organization. But the goal is to help you move to a more agile design process with faster approvals, more natural collaboration, and smoother developer handoff. Ultimately, I hope some of these ideas can help make your lives a little bit easier. They're processes that work for us, and they may not be able to be taken wholesale and put into your company and work, but I think that if you kind of see the concepts behind them, hopefully you can adapt them to make them work for your company. So let's talk a little bit about how LookThink got here. So in the past, we delivered static wireframes for our applications and websites. Those came in the form of either a PDF or a printed format. They were complex, they were comprehensive, they were full of thoughtful analysis and information architecture, and we would hand them over to people, and people just wouldn't get it. We would spend hours and days and weeks on wireframes and put a lot of thought and energy and effort into them, and ultimately people had trouble following and understanding. They were confused. Overall, we had provided them with a great deliverable, but they lacked the clarity that the clients needed to understand the value of what we were bringing to them. Our hard work was going unnoticed and unappreciated, and we were creating great business solutions. We were solving difficult information architecture challenges. We were providing awesomely thought out user experiences, and the clients, again, were just kind of not noticing them. Everybody was caught up trying to slog through the deliverable. We wound up getting to points where we had to document the wireframe so heavily to explain what was going on that we were damn near doubling our effort in creating static wireframes. And then once we documented it, people wouldn't read it. And if you look at the screen, I built this and I can barely read this. So we wound up having to go through it again in the first meeting and then the second meeting. And then once we got to the development team, it was a whole separate process. We actually got to a point where we were pasting screenshots of the application, the static wireframes, into 187-page Word document, requirements document, and then we were using track changes to make sure we were meeting those requirements. It was ludicrous. A lot of this has gotten alleviated since we've started using Jira, but again, it lacked that clarity to actually get our message across. The feedback was also scattered, unfocused. People were missing out on those great business solutions that we were providing. Not to mention the fact that it was killing our timelines. We were really stretching things by the time we got to the development phase. So, as I mentioned before, our information architecture and our user experience solutions were just getting lost in the shuffle. It flat out was not working, and it became very defeating for us because you put a lot of time and energy and thought into this to only have people try to get through something they don't understand. So I remember one time working on what you see on the screen here. Should be a fairly straightforward search and display. You type something into the search bar, you get the results, you can click through the results. There's a comparison aspect of it. And we laid out the experience in a static PDF format. And I walked them through it in the first meeting, and I did not think anybody should have any trouble following the 14 wireframes that I printed, but I was very, very wrong. The first meeting took forever. The second meeting, then we had to go back through everything we went through in the first meeting, same with the third, and they couldn't imagine where links were going. They couldn't keep track of the flows. They didn't know what page they were on. Every time we sent something out, it took a week for them to get back and analyze it. They had the same questions. They would come back with then even more new dumb questions. But the thing is that they weren't dumb questions. The people were genuinely confused. So our whole job as designers and information architects is to clarify information for people. But what we weren't doing was our job of clarifying the deliverable itself that we were presenting to them. So while we were confident in the problems that we were solving and we were confident of the clarity of the product itself and the overall outcome, there were so many other steps along the way that needed clarity before we got there. We realized we were losing the fight, not to our work, but to the static wireframe as a deliverable. So what do we do to rectify this? How do we move away from confusing static wireframes? We committed to codeless prototyping as our method of agile delivery. In the course of a month, we stopped and dropped static wireframing altogether. We made a company-wide commitment to using UXPin as our main delivery method. And we embraced that any initial upfront investment of creating a prototype was going to be saved in the confusion throughout the rest of the project. So now literally everything we deliver prior to development gets delivered in UXPin. Our wireframes, our style tiles, our design, the prototype itself, obviously, and why. In short, it creates that clarity for all parties involved. It adds clarity to the process that was just missing from the static wireframes. And we'll talk more about some of these points later, but I can tell you that the first project that we tested this experiment on was the previous product that I mentioned with the 14 wireframes, the same type of thing. But we had some good ideas as to how to better move users through the site. So as I sat there and tried to walk through this in my head and how I was going to explain this to them, I realized that I didn't want to go through the same debacle that we had with the first phase. So for phase 2, I spent about a day and a half putting everything together in UXPin. And the next meeting I sent the link out to them. I ran through UXPin in a screen share, and within that phone call, within the hour, they understood, they got it, and they had signed off on it. The time savings is in the hundreds of percent. What had taken them several weeks to come to an agreement on was now cleared up in an hour. I was amazed myself. But what we had done is created that clarity for them that they could follow things, they could understand our vision, and they could click and feel like they had a part of it. So in addition to client clarity, it has opened up a new world of clarity with both our own designers and our own, with both our development team and other development teams that we work with. So prototypes have now become our acceptance criteria and our requirements documentation. So developers now can click through the prototype and understand how their work fits into the entire product as a whole, instead of just reading pieces in a requirements document and building that out to satisfy acceptance criteria. So the transition to dumping static wireframes had a few challenges, but overall it was much more painless than I even anticipated. But if you're going to make the move to prototyping, there are a few things to consider. One, there will be a learning curve with the technology. You're not going to know how to do things right away, and it's like learning Photoshop or Sketch. It'll take a little while, but soon everything will be second nature. But just account for the fact that you won't know how to do some things right off the bat. 2, don't panic when you feel like you're spending way too much time on things up front. In reality, you probably are. But there's no doubt that creating even a simple prototype, it's going to take longer than creating a static wireframe, but there's also no doubt that it alleviates the confusion down the road. And we'll cover some more of the benefits of that investment up front later. 3, the timelines for deliverables will be different throughout the project. So something that took 6 hours to wireframe as a static wireframe might take 8 to do in a prototype. In the later stages of a project, when it gets more complex, you're basically doing development without code. So you have to kind of build in a level of testing to make sure all of your interactions work, to make sure all of your instances work. More complex things create some more time, obviously. And then to that point, you're going to have to accept that there are going to be some things that you can't demonstrate and that aren't worth demonstrating. Some functionality is just not worth the effort to produce, regardless of whether you're using UXPin or Agile or whatever. It's okay to fake it, and it's okay to come close, and you'd be surprised how a reasonable facsimile can get the point across, and we'll cover some other ways to get around not having to build things. So how do we as LookThink incorporate these prototypes into our process? As you can see from the diagram, pretty much everywhere and in every way. Information architects are creating them and sending them off to the client. The client is commenting on them and sending them back to the information architects. The information architects are sharing them with the designers to get them involved with what is coming. The information architects are sending them to the developers to gut check feasibility. The designers are sending them the client for design review. The client is sending them back for design with design feedback. Designers and information architects are sending them to developers along with other files that will help them get to development. The developers then take that all, turn that into a working code, and then that goes to QA, which they can then check against the prototype, and ultimately we then send it back to the client for review, and then it eventually goes live. So they play, the UXPin prototypes play a major role in our day-to-day life. So let's get down to the nitty-gritty here. What have we learned? What has been successful for us? We're going to go through a few kind of best practices that we have found. We'll start with number 1, which is to prototype in chunks and understand the difference between your depth versus your breadth. So to stay agile, obviously, we really try to eliminate a big design effort up front. But we have to keep track of the experience as a whole to make sure that there aren't any big gaps that come back to bite us later. And how do we reconcile that depth versus that breadth? So for me, everything starts on paper. Call me old-fashioned, I guess I am, but I'm a firm believer in it, and I sketch my pages out. I number them, I put arrows, I put question marks, I put links to the numbers, I put stuff like see page 4. I go through the entire experience end to end from a flow perspective based on the goals of the product. I write out those major flows in words and boxes to make sure I don't have any gaps, and I start shuffling papers around, pretending I'm clicking through it. It looks ridiculous. I get side-eye glances from my coworkers, but it works. It's informal, and it keeps me from getting caught up in the details too early. So I usually do this whole paper process until I start getting to the point where I'm thinking too much about those details, thinking about what the link should say or what the ragged icon is. And at that point, I know I'm down far enough, and it's time to start getting it into the computer and get to prototyping it on the screen, actually. So these manic sketches get translated into UXPin, and they get linked up to build the very first basic version of the prototype. So they're simple boxes with some text, some buttons and links, and this helps us identify anything that may have been missed during the sketching phase. We can identify holes in the application where we need answers. And also now, because we can actually click on things in the prototype, we can identify rabbit holes and any kind of seemingly simple interactions that may require additional actions or flows. So an example of this, as you can see on the screen, we're working on a large application, and the product owner wanted to add some workflow functionality. So we started building out a task assignment piece of the puzzle. And it started out simple with a link to a task, a modal to select who to assign it to, and then the assignee would receive a message inside the application. But what we realized was, while it was an okay experience, it really was missing some critical elements. And there was a lot to think about surrounding that simple action. We realized that it needed a place to view the tasks that you've sent and view the tasks that you've received. We realized that there were permission issues, and how did you manage those permissions with regards to who could send tasks to whom? And then what if I don't know how to solve my assigned task? Can I refuse it? Can I assign it to someone else? What happens if I do those things? How do I see those? Then are there deadlines associated with this task, et cetera, et cetera. So while all of those things didn't need to be ready for the first release, by being able to click through the prototype, we were quickly able to recognize that we weren't even quite at an MVP for this feature, and we left it alone to focus on more pressing features. So if we just thought that through, put it together in some requirements, and sent it to the developers for a list to assign, a link to assign, a dropdown and a modal to choose, an alert to go to the assignee, what we would have built was a pretty subpar and potentially frustrating experience for the users. So once we have that simple box and flow version, then we can start zooming in at certain points in the application and prototyping out particular widgets. So what you're seeing on the screen now is an example of how those boxes come together to then build out the individual pieces where you can go and edit a field, you can then ignore the field, you can submit the field, you can validate your entire your entire application. So this is where you start getting into the more zoomed in chunks of the prototype. And if you get too deep into it, and when you're in this zoomed in version, you can always kind of zoom back out and take a look at that experience prototype to make sure you don't have tunnel vision. So what you're seeing again is that after kind of testing that lo-fi version, we'll come in and increase the interactive fidelity, and then we can hand this off to the development and design team. And this way we're developing in smaller chunks at the start, and then developing in small increments as we go. So sometimes, as I mentioned earlier, it's better to link out to interactions and not spend some time building certain things out. If you have an example of something that's working on another site, oftentimes I will just throw that link into the prototype. For an example, see this URL, and then you can link that to send that to the development team, have them validate it, and tell you whether they can do that or whether it looks reasonable. And you don't have to spend your time in UXPin building out something that is unnecessary, and it leaves you time to do other things. So at each point along this path, from the wide to the narrow, we're trying to get feedback from clients and developers. And then this way, our breadth, our vision, as well as our depth into the individual features are always aligned across the whole team. Everybody has seen it, is paying attention to it, and people have a sense of where things fit into the bigger picture. So best practice number 2 is prioritizing your use cases for prototyping. So if you go back in time and you think about our simple boxes, labels, prototype, before we started working on the individual widgets, we have our end-to-end user flows, and we know we have all of our steps accounted for, our scenarios covered, and our decision points noted, but we don't have any serious interactions. So how do we decide what to prototype first? For us, there are a few indicators that we use to determine what to begin prototyping first. The first one for us, it's kind of a dance between a few things, but kind of in order from most important to least important. One is, has a client expressed any confusion or concern over a particular piece of functionality? If so, focus on that. You'll have a much more pleasant stakeholder after they've seen something and they understand it. So having a client or a stakeholder confused about or hung up on a piece of functionality is really a surefire way to add hours to a project and just increase the timeline. 2, what are the highest value targets? Are there pieces of the application, if done wrong, would cause serious confusion? What is your weakest link? Where do you stand to lose people? Is there anything that could stop a user dead in their tracks and keep them from continuing? If so, those are the pieces that are worth spending extra time on first to make sure you get absolutely right. So if you're building, in this instance, a photo sharing app, make sure that the user can upload a photo before you go and demonstrate the settings page to the stakeholder. You want to validate that the person can do what the app is being built to do first. Number 3, this screen should look familiar. It's what are the most complex interactions, and can you demonstrate them by linking to interactions on another site? If you can demonstrate them from another site, you can save a lot more time not having to build it in UXPin, and you can have more time for other things. So in this instance, you find a dropdown, you put a link to the dropdown, and then you shoot that off to your development team and say, hey, is this something we can do? They validate it, come back and say, yep. And then you can kind of hold off on actually building that out, or you can potentially not have to build it out at all for the client if you send that link to the client and they follow what you're trying to build. 4, what are we using any pieces of commonly accepted UI patterns? Or what are we copying from elsewhere? Do you really need to lay out the login screen first thing to show to the client if there are more pressing interactions that might be misunderstood? So kind of a good rule of thumb is if it's nothing seriously novel, if you're not changing what is already recognized as a commonly accepted UI pattern, you can usually save that for later in the prototyping process. And then number 5, of course, should be obvious. What part of the product have we not figured out yet? If you're building a website and you don't have content for a page, put that page into the flow so that the client can see that you can get there and how you get there, but it serves as a record when it's blank to say, hey, we don't have anything for this. We need to be conscious of the fact that it's here without content. And then you can go and fill in the blanks as you go. But it doesn't interrupt the flow if you leave it in there blank, because the user can click and get to it. So best practice number 3 is pacing your fidelity. Fidelity for us actually means a couple of different things. There's interactive fidelity and then design fidelity. So interactive fidelity is how true to form the prototype is to what we're going to actually deliver. And then design fidelity is how close it looks to the actual layout from a design perspective. So generally, earlier in the sprint, the lower both the interactive fidelity and the design fidelity. You want to resist the temptation to go for that wow factor early on. There's a time and a place for that, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But it's an easy way to get caught up in things that don't necessarily matter right from the get-go. So we talked earlier about translating the paper drawings into simple boxes and links and creating that low fidelity, simple interaction prototype. And this lo-fi version has a couple of benefits. It's going to act as a sitemap or a 10,000-foot view of everything that's going on. You want to leave it at just the basic interactions. So spend very little time on it, put low interactions in, buttons and links, some basic boxes, images, maybe drop downs if they're critical to navigation, some simple modals, and just the things that allow you to get through the app and understand what's going on. It's a low investment. It's maybe a day or two for a simple site, maybe a week or so for something more complex. Obviously, the size of the product determines how long you can take on this or how long you should take on this. But it allows you to find holes in your requirements, any errors and missing states. What did you uncover along the way that you found out wasn't there to begin with? And it's better to learn that early on than to find it in sprint 10. So going back to the example of the task assignment, we were able to very quickly say, no, we don't want to do that right now, instead of creating it and then realizing, oh, we didn't build enough. Now we have to continue to add on to that. And there are other things that people are demanding, but now we have to finish and round out this particular piece that we don't know that is even valid for the users. So the lo-fi version, though, it doesn't mean you should fake your content if you don't have to. You can get away with lorem ipsum in the lo-fi, but it's better to use real content, even if it's rough, because content is really the heart of design. If you have the resources and you can put a copywriter or a content strategist on your Scrum team, that's great. But I always tell my team, if we don't have final content, put rough content in, even if it's not perfect, even if you have to make some of it up. I encourage it for a couple of reasons. One, you get better at writing for the web and applications the more you do it. And two, it helps you understand the product better because you have to think about what you're writing and think about how users will read it. And then three, really the best way to get content from the client is to put wrong content in there. They will come back and correct you. And oftentimes it works out and we write good content for them and they leave it. But trust me, they will replace it if they don't like it. And it starts the dialogue. One of the biggest delays that we have for a lot of our projects is waiting on client content. So it's beneficial for us to put our own content in there and then have them react to it because it gives us a jumping off point. And why is this content so important? The more realistic the content, the better both the designers and the developers can understand the full scope of the system. And then not to mention the fact that your whole design may break if you drop in content as an afterthought. So once you've shown and tested this prototype in the lo-fi state with the simple interactions, then you can dive into a more high fidelity interaction and design prototype. So the high fidelity version being the version that we saw with all of the interactions working and the tiny pieces and widgets within actually working and seeing how those things affect other pieces of the page. So for the design though, we never really design our functional prototypes as it moves from interactive lo-fi to interactive hi-fi. We keep our designs, our design prototypes completely separate. We try to keep a level of polish on all of our prototypes, even the functional ones, just because it helps people understand and it gives a level of hierarchy. But the fully designed prototypes that we do are kept completely separate. So more often than not, what we do is the designers are moving in a parallel track and designing in Sketch, and then they'll put the designs back into UXPin for review. So what they do then is they take the designs, they keep the flows the same, and they're making it feel more like it's an actual website. And then we're not putting in all of the interactions. We're maybe putting in a couple of them so that the client can get a sense of how drop-down menus will work and how certain things will look. But it's not we're not putting design over top of the fully functional prototype. So, and as I mentioned in the hi-fi prototype, we actually start to pull back some of the functionality. So there's no really real reason to build the same logic and complexity back into the design. So we use simple toggles to fade in images for the states like menus, and here in this example, tabs and things. It's much faster. It's one interaction UXPin versus potentially several. And it doesn't throw the client off that as much as you think, because they've already seen how it will work from the functional prototype. So in the design prototype, they know what to expect. They're not looking for the fully fleshed out system. Best practice number 4 is annotating your user flows. The ideal state for us is that our prototype becomes the documentation. With complex enterprise products, you might not eliminate all the documentation, but you will certainly reduce the quantity and the pain of maintaining that. So we like to write our user flows right next to the prototype in a sort of how do I get through this format. It allows the developers and the client to follow a user's path through the interactions on the screen. So the format is a user comes into the page and is looking for a particular item. They can search, and we put a picture of the search bar, and they can click on the magnifying glass, et cetera, et cetera. So you can read here kind of how we handle that. And you also want to make sure that you're handling all the different states of that screen. So any modal windows, any states where there is no data, any failure states, any error states, not just happy path, because you don't want to rely on the developers having to know how to bring up a certain instance of something. You want to be able to say, here are the different states, and here is what causes these, so they can have a better understanding of how it gets there. It does take time, but you can copy the triggers straight from the prototype, and that saves a lot of time. So as you build something out in the prototype, you can literally drag that element to the right side and have it function just the same. And then as you update things in the prototype, just drag it over and it'll replace it, obviously. So why do we do this? Why do we bother spending this time on that notes section? Again, it's all for clarity, creating that clarity between all the parties. It ensures that our development team can see all the nuanced interaction models that they may have missed by just clicking around haphazardly. The developers get a better sense of the product as a whole, and they know how the piece that they're working on fits into the greater picture. So they're not just building in a vacuum one chunk without understanding exactly how it affects all the other chunks. It allows the developers to plan ahead before their sprint begins. So while we're designing for sprint number 5, they can be thinking about sprint number 6 and understanding better how those pieces fit together again. And it gives the QA people more contextual acceptance criteria. They aren't just checking boxes on a Trello board. They actually get to play around on a living product and understand how all the pieces fit together. So it creates a common language between our designers and developers as well. Developers can air out any concerns or suggestions at a very early state. The designers can go to the developers and say, hey, I'm thinking about doing this. Okay, great, let's talk about that. And there have been plenty of instances where the development team has noticed something that would have gone otherwise missed by the IA or design team. So, hey guys, just FYI, there's a state that is missing here. What happens when XYZ happens? And then you know that you have to go back and build that in. As well as the notes there also bake in a level of user testing. So every person that has their hand on the product is commenting on how it will actually work, not just some theoretical model or an idea of the product in a requirements document. It's also beneficial of the notes section because some, as I've mentioned several times, some interactions are just not going to be worth building. You have to kind of run a cost-benefit analysis of how much time you're going to spend building something out versus the benefit that comes from the development team or the designers actually seeing something. And then you can annotate something on the sidebar that you can link to on another page, which we've seen previously in the deck. Number 5 is to validate your small builds often. The more you validate, the more agile you remain. If you're validating often, you don't wind up wasting too much time on things that aren't working. You can quickly find things that are missing, and you can keep yourself from going too far too fast because within a prototype, you can actually feel the app becoming unwieldy. So you can tell, okay, this is getting to be too much. Let's slow down and actually figure out what we need to do for this step. We don't really have too many hard and fast rules as far as when to validate. As far as from a time perspective, you just don't want to go too long between reviews. So send small pieces out once they're complete. And what do I mean by complete? Really, it's just that you can complete a task and that you're not left stuck halfway in the middle of something. So sometimes it's easy to get halfway through something and think the person will pick up the rest, and in reality, they're not going to. So think through the entire flow, think through the process, make sure that you go end to end, and then that goes a long way. Make sure your data is correct. Having correct data and that things are functioning properly, obviously, goes a long way in helping stakeholders understand. So what have the results been since switching to Agile prototyping? For us, things just run smoother. We're able to spend more time on the things that matter and spend less time dealing with the crappy client relation stuff. I mentioned earlier that literally everything we do gets put into UXPin. So because we put everything into UXPin and manage iterations with the tool, everyone is looking at the same version. There's no risk of someone opening the wrong PDF from an email last week instead of the most recent version. You don't have to resend files every time somebody deletes an email. Having a prototype, it creates that common language between the client, the developers, and the designers. So it's a much more team-oriented process. Everyone is in on the vision, and everybody sees it take place. Sees it take shape. And it seems like a very small thing, but I can't tell you how many times we've had clients looking at something that we know is the correct size and saying that it feels too small. And then we find out that they've been looking at it the entire time at 66% in Acrobat Viewer. When now in UXPin, we know that they're viewing it at the correct size. There aren't any zooming issues. We can easily set our breakpoints. We know how it will display. We know it will display reliably. It comes up in a browser. It feels like a web app. It feels like an application, or it feels like a website. It feels like a web app or phone app. And this is why we take all of our designs and put them back into UXPin, even after building out the functional prototype. We've seen much faster approval from clients. They just get it. The example before where we spent an hour on the phone and showed them and they understood. They aren't the same questions like we used to get. Everything's more valid. They are actually paying attention and understanding what we're building. And because they're not caught up in the deliverable, they'll focus more on the business solutions and they're focused more on the user experience. They are actually giving relevant feedback. We've also noticed that there's a higher quality and consistency of the designs due to this upfront clarity and having everybody on the team on board from the beginning. Overall, we're getting more and better work done with the same time that we have, since we're spending less cycles on the petty, wasted stuff. We're having better conversations with developers. They're taking more ownership on their product. And there's a greater level of understanding in the products that we're creating. They get it. They get the whole picture. And they're not just building that small piece that they were told to build. The comments, not to mention the comments and the feedback from both clients, developers, our own team. It's faster. It's kept in one place. And overall, we're just getting better feedback and questions and reviews from everybody across the board. So overall, life is just easier with prototyping. We have thoroughly enjoyed using it, and our clients have thoroughly enjoyed us using it as well. They've been thrilled with the change, and we're happy to see it affecting our business and helping us do better work. So, in summary, the 5 best practices to explore are to prototype in chunks and manage your depth versus your breadth. Prioritize your use cases for prototyping, pace your fidelity, annotate your user flows, and validate small builds often. So again, I'd like to thank Jerry and the team over at UXPin. They've been great to work with. Those of you that aren't a part of the communities that they've built, I would recommend getting into them. There's a lot of great links being shared and a lot of great conversations happening. And I think that is where the conversation will continue after some questions. So we can open up the floor to everybody who has anything to talk about.
Great, thanks, Nate. That was a fantastic presentation. I was looking at the chat here, and it looks like some people already picked up some interesting tips, especially with regards to the annotation tactics that you were describing.
Right.
So yeah, everybody, as we normally do, as we go into Q&A, I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll here. This poll basically ensures that the stuff that we create is aligned with what people actually want to learn more about and are currently struggling with. So we would greatly appreciate everyone's participation here. Meanwhile, let's go ahead and get into the questions here. We've got quite a few, so we'll try to go through them in as many as we can. So Rachel had a very relevant question, and actually I'll be combining some of the questions because I'm starting to see a few themes form here. So there's a question from Rachel about what type of user testing do you do, and then how does that happen with your prototypes? How does that fit into your process?
Sure. So the nice part about it is that kind of everybody is a user tester. Sometimes, unfortunately, we just don't get the budget to do user testing. Ideally, we want to, and ideally, you want to be able to do that. But the nice part about having the prototype is that you can send it to virtually anybody and have them start banging on it and have them explain things that they don't understand. We've done user testing on both our functional prototypes and our design prototypes. Oftentimes we will build out a fully designed, fleshed out prototype to follow the script of what we're trying to test and what we're trying to validate, and just create the flows that are necessary to get through the testing. And that has worked for us. So you're not spending a ton of time creating a fully designed website or a fully designed application. You're just creating, okay, here's what we want to validate. Let's put this into testing, see if people get it, and then get that feedback from that particular piece. And then you can do that for whatever pieces you have throughout the application.
Right. And on a sort of a related note here, this is sort of reflect back on within the team and how you use prototypes. So Mikolaj is curious, how do you make sure that developers can find and observe each interaction state in the prototype? So do you present all possible states for them on a separate page? I think his question is really about how do you make sure that developers have a complete view, right, of all the states, and there aren't going to be some states that are hidden in your prototype, and because they don't access it, they forget to build them in.
Sure. Yeah, so that sidebar is really where that comes in handy. And it started basically because we were getting feedback like that. Hey, Nate, what happens when this happens? Oh, okay, well, you have to click here, 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 and here. Well, okay, nobody would have figured that out. And so we started taking those in states and putting them into the sidebar to say, here is what happens when you click here, 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 and here. Sometimes it can get unwieldy to manage the UXPin within the product, within the UXPin product itself. So sometimes we have to get creative as to how we show certain states if we're doing complex things inside of a modal window, or if we're having multiple tabs. Sometimes you need to just create another page and link it up and fake it. But what we try to do is use that sidebar to say, here are the states and here are the instances where it occurs. So almost building out the logic behind it. So if this and this, then this happens, and here's the state. Click on that, and you can see it pop up. That's where if your information architects or your designers have a little bit of development knowledge, that can help, because they can kind of write those if statements for you in a way. But usually it's just here is the state, and here is how you get there. And even writing it from a user perspective, here is what the user does to get here, is very, very helpful as well. Right.
It's kind of goes back to that lightweight documentation, right? And there always will be a need for some documentation, I think, because you do need something to quickly unravel for developers what all the possibilities are, like a map, right, before they go in and start exploring. And now we've got a question from clear, and I think this is also from somebody else, so I am consolidating this. But she's curious with, do you ever encounter clients who seem to get stuck on lo-fi prototypes, so they don't grasp the vision of what you're showing? And then even on the opposite end of the spectrum, do you ever see them getting stuck on hi-fi prototypes and, for instance, starting to say that that's the wrong color, or giving feedback that's not really aligned with what you're seeking?
Yeah, I think you're never going to get away from having certain clients that just don't get things. So to say that this has solved all of our problems and that we don't have clients get hung up on certain things, I mean that's just not the case. So you kind of a lot of it is reading the client and understanding the client and kind of testing the waters with various bits of the lo-fi, and if they don't understand it, then you can kind of tell, okay, the level that you're going to have to get get them to sign off. So your lo-fi becomes a little more hi-fi, but the idea is that you're not building in more than you need to. I guess is kind of the lesson behind that. As far as getting caught up in the high fidelity, so what we tried to do before we build the high fidelity the high design fidelity, what we try to do is have the clients have gone through a series of design exercises, whether it be style tiles or a mood board, going so far as to create them, some of the elements, and maybe even seeing a static design or two that they can react to, so that when we get to placing it into the actual wireframe, when we get to putting it into the actual prototype, what it actually feels like is their website. We've actually had clients on the other side of it who say, well, wait a minute, why isn't this working? This is the actual website, right? And we have to explain to them that there's no code involved, that this is just the design. So, but that's a better problem to have than the previous. So I hope that answers the question, but I guess the answer is to make sure that your clients have seen enough of the design elements that they're not surprised by the hi-fi version. And then if they get caught up in certain things not working, you have to kind of go back and explain to them that, we're not trying to rebuild the prototype. We're not wasting time rebuilding what we already showed you in the functional prototype. We're really just trying to show you certain big elements, certain big chunks as simple fades and things that are hidden if they need to be designed. So certain tab states and things like that.
Right, and I guess on a related note, in terms of like estimating that time, so we have so there's a person in chat, BS Design is curious. So how do you guys estimate how long that prototyping time might take, or do you constantly go back and revisit those estimations even when you're in development? So the context of this question is he's basically thinking about how do you judge how long it'll take to prototype an MVP for a product.
That's a good question. I mean, we usually have a thought of, we've thought through things kind of end to end, and then a lot of times we're dealing with a fixed number of hours or a fixed number of dollars. So we're constantly shuffling what we're building out to be more complex with what we're building and keeping more simple. So for us to estimate it's a combination of kind of feeling out what the client is really looking for and how much complexity comes with that, and then saying, okay, that is a huge lift, and here are the things that you sacrifice if we do that, because we can't do this other thing with the set of hours that we have. So that works for fixed price projects. For long-term things, you're kind of constantly going back and revisiting the hours estimations and saying, you presumably you have a backlog of stuff, and you're focusing on the next thing on the list, and bringing new things in and saying, are we pausing on this piece, or are we continuing to go? But that's kind of, that's how we approach it. We do quite a few fixed price projects, and it's just a constant shuffle of here's what you're giving up if we continue to spend time on this other thing, and that helps the client understand kind of what how the minimum product should be, is that conversation.
Right, right. And this is a little bit of a kind of shift in the type of question here. So I noticed a few people are actually asking about UXPin itself. So I figured we would knock out some of these questions. So I can chime in here as well. But Nate, I mean, of course, if you use us for your purposes, your perspective is probably going to be the most useful here. So somebody here was asking, they were trying to interpret us as kind of a product compared to Invision and Acture. So Virginia was saying that her assessment is that UXPin feels like it has more functionalities than Invision, and it's a little bit on the creation end in terms of the power. It's sort of like Acture, and she's just wondering if that's kind of the correct assessment.
I would say, yeah. We reached a point with Invision where we were quickly we quickly grew out of the functionality of Invision. We still use it for certain things. Oftentimes it's the fastest way to get something out, but you can really do the same thing in UXPin. But yeah, I would say the learning curve was much shallower, I guess, for UXPin. Acture, I haven't spent a lot of time in it, but I was told that it's a little difficult to get everything learned, and it can become unwieldy. So for us, it was a combination of growing out of what Invision was doing for us and needing to put some of the more complex interactions into things. So things like multi-state elements, things like the complex animations, those are the things that really help us in our day-to-day. In Acture, I'm sorry, Invision is not at that level right now.
Right, and just to quickly put things in context, the way that I try to explain to people who come with me with questions about UXPin versus Acture versus Invision, which are two obviously very common design tools, is I try to explain as Acture is very powerful, but it's not the most user-friendly and it lacks collaboration. Invision is very collaborative, but it lacks creation power. And so we try to plug that gap. So we try to think of ourselves as almost you could think of it as a more collaborative Acture or a more powerful Invision in a way. You wanted to kind of quickly understand that. So now actually pulling back to some of the questions here about process. Let me take a look here. I know we've got quite a few questions, so I want to try to get through as many as we can. Let's see. So Jonathan had a really interesting question here, which is, in your process, there's sort of the rough prototypes, and then there's what you refer to as the very high-fidelity design prototypes. And Jonathan's curious, how does the interaction design get resolved between the two? Because as you mentioned, the design prototype doesn't have as much interaction design. So how is the sort of final interaction design communicated to clients?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're fortunate enough that we work kind of in the same room and in hand in hand with our developers. So our developers are able to ask questions along the way, and I'm assuming you're maybe referring to some of the more minutia of it, like how fast is this going to open, and things like that. So if I'm wrong, please comment in the chat and let me know if I'm not answering the right question. But we work hand in hand with our developers, and we are able to basically show them something up front, meet with them, and say, here's what I'm envisioning for this. Here's a close enough representation of it to show the client. The client usually gets it from that. They're not necessarily super caught up in the speed or the way in which it opens, or the fact that it's not sliding down perfectly. They're really just kind of wowed with the fact that they're seeing something do that. And then we talk to the developer and we say, hey, here's what I want to do with this. Here's a couple of examples that I've seen. Can you give us an estimate as far as the which one of these is maybe fastest or easiest to get done, and then we can talk about the most complex one and see what the weigh the benefit of spending the extra time to do that one, versus the low investment one. and then they get back to us. We talk about that. We maybe potentially adjust the designs, and then we go into development, and then we're doing a lot of the kind of minute fixing at the QA level. So this is a little fast. Maybe we need to slow that down, or this really shouldn't zip this way up. Like let's make that slide. So you're using the UXPin to kind of validate the idea, and then you're still going through a phase of kind of QA and tweaking through development. But the key is just constant communication and having the developers be a part of it from the beginning.
Right. And I think you mentioned this too, is because you work so closely with the client, by the time they see that prototype, that high-fi visual prototype, the interactions, they're already familiar with the interactions because those interactions were built out in the previous prototypes. So that's not, you build up to that, right? And that was sort of the whole point of what you were talking about with Fidelity.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
You never want to make a jump in Fidelity in that sense.
Exactly.
And so let's see. So the next question we had actually is from Pam, which is talking about how the prototypes fit into the sprints. So she says that in her case, the design is so far ahead of the current sprint for functionality, which the way that I interpret that is that they design far ahead of development so that their functionality or requirements may even change. And so she's curious, when you create prototypes, is that specific to a certain sprint, or do you work sort of ahead of developers, or how does that workflow kind of play out?
So oftentimes what is happening is the product owner has kind of made a decision as to what is going to make it into a particular sprint. So we have to get the following things done in 2 weeks. And then what happens is the development team will kind of start the back-end architecture that they need to do to get things running. So this is on a more complex application, but they'll go do the architecture that they need to get the business logic running, and I'll run in parallel with them and build out. I'll look at those. I'll look at their stories and suss out what needs to be done from the UX side, and then I'll build the prototypes out to then test with the product owner and say, hey, is this doing what we expect it to do? Is this is where all this data is going to be displayed? Is this what the users is expecting to see? Is this how we want things to act? He's signing off on that, and then we're passing those UX tasks back to the developers and saying, okay, guys, go look at the prototype, vet this for that it matches up with what you're doing, and then they say yes or no, and then they start building out the kind of front end of it, and then we pass it off to the designer, who is then designing those interactions, the pieces of that then get folded into the development after they have the front end. So I'm not sure, Jerry. Can you give her my Slack name?
Yeah.
And I can try to follow up with her later, maybe if there's a more specific.
Yeah, and if Nate, if you're open to it, I could also drop in your email if people wanted to email you questions as well. That works.
Yeah.
Let me go ahead and get Nate's email here. So if you guys wanted to, let's see, it is, here we go. Alrighty, give me one moment.
Yeah, I don't know that I specifically if that specifically addresses the design being far ahead, but if she has a more specific instance, I'm happy to try to talk through it with her.
Yep, cool. And let's see here. So the next question we've got here is, oh, somebody was just curious, how long generally are your sprints?
It really depends on the project. Oftentimes we're working with another development team that's not ours, so we adapt to their sprints. So it's anywhere from 2 weeks to 6 weeks. I know that's not a great answer, but it kind of it fluctuates as to kind of what team we're working with.
Right. Yeah, that's what I've heard too. I know it like you mentioned, it really depends. Some folks will go with 1 week. Some, as they dive further into development, may end up extending it to 3 weeks. It really depends on just what is the particular user story or story point you're trying to satisfy.
Right.
All right.
Yeah, I guess for us as a company, we kind of do continuous, almost continuous development, if you will. So we're kind of working within mini sprints and then handing things off in small chunks and then kind of coming back and iterating on them as we go.
Right. And let's see. So we had an interesting question here. So Cindy has a very relevant question about deciding when prototyping is needed versus not. So she's curious, do you guys have like a threshold, whether that's in terms of the size of project, right? Whether that's length of time, size of the budget, number of people on the team, at which you decide a prototype is needed or not? She's wondering because she's a PM and her team has a wide range of projects that vary from very small to very large. And in that case, it's kind of trying to prioritize which projects should have prototyping built in, which ones can you maybe go a bit lighter.
Absolutely. I mean, we're the same way. We kind of started to think about that threshold, and then we just found that we're just going to do everything. Like I mentioned earlier, we were doing everything in UXPin. But that doesn't mean that you have to necessarily prototype everything out. You can maybe get away with ways we've solved this in the past is, okay, we don't need to prototype out everything because it's a smaller project. It's generally understood how things are going to work, but there's this one piece that we're a little unsure of. We'd like to make sure that gets hashed out. So great. So let's spend some time actually building that out and iterating on that in UXPin. And it may be its own, project in UXPin. We built just little small widget projects and said, okay, let's take a look at this and validate this one piece of this one part of a website and see how that's going to work. We didn't build the entire prototype around it because that was already somewhat determined and that could be done much simpler. So prototyping for prototyping's sake isn't always beneficial. But it comes down to, how understanding are your clients of the process and of what you're doing for them, and then kind of how, where can you pull out the small chunks that people might not understand and do those instead of having to build, something that's already known.
Right. I remember I'd spoken with the product manager, and the way that she explained it was, you prototype based upon the risk of the user story, right? And you touched upon this, which is really whatever is the most riskiest assumptions need to be prototyped. And that was sort of the same thing that I have heard from a UX manager at Autodesk as well, who uses our tool, and they don't use it to prototype everything, but they use it for the most novel or the most, kind of the more out there ideas, right? That maybe aren't following convention. They absolutely prototype that.
That's exactly right. Yep.
And let's see. So Arian is curious, in your process, are you creating a master prototype or multiple prototypes for each story?
We're keeping a master prototype running the entire time. So we will often handle, I'll usually create an iteration within UXPin anytime we're jumping into something that's going to drastically change the application. So if there's a piece of, for instance, the workflow piece that I mentioned earlier, when I went to start that process, I created a new iteration so that I could focus on that piece. So that's one way to handle it. It's it's much easier to keep everything kind of in one place, I found. So we try not to have a handful of different prototypes, but we do separate out, again, that functional versus that design.
Right. Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The next question, and this is I've heard this come up before as well, is Dane is curious, if you're integrated with a development team, why wouldn't you make changes directly in the code rather than in a hi-fi prototype or mock-up? So I guess he's curious, what are some of the benefits of still iterating on a polished prototype versus just going straight to production code?
That's a valid question. In the case of the application that you were seeing, it was a language barrier issue, and it helps to just keep the developers understanding of what's going on in the application. Generally, we won't. I'm trying to fully understand the question, but I mean, we'll go back in and add functionality to an existing piece of functionality, but that's usually when it just changes something on the front end. If it doesn't change something on the front end, then usually we can communicate it to them. Sometimes we don't, and I guess sometimes we don't prototype it. If it's just, hey, there's going to be new data that shows up, or there's going to be a new link that we need to include here, it's not necessarily necessary to put it into the prototype. And I don't know, did that answer the question?
Yeah, no, I think you made a good point, which is sometimes when you make changes directly in code, then people might even perceive that as a sort of more serious change, versus if you still have it in a prototype, it still feels a little bit more experimental, and people seem to be more open to further changes from that, which may benefit the business and the user. That's just a little bit of some feedback I heard from others when that question has come up.
Sure.
And Charlie's curious about your process, which is, do you work out all of your alternative layout ideas in UXPin, or do you sort of lock all that in pencil and you just move to UXPin once you have kind of the general layout and feel worked out?
It depends. Usually I try to work that through in pencil, and somewhat prior to getting into UXPin, just because it's easy to get caught up in pushing things around. But it does wind up changing. You get it in there, because I have a background in design. I tend to put some level of hierarchy and polish onto the prototype. So you do find that stuff doesn't fit. You do wind up having to move stuff around, which I think is a good, that I think is a good level of changes that need to be made. But generally speaking, I try to think through at least where things are going to go from a boxes standpoint. Like, this chunk of data is going to go here, this chunk is going to go here, before I get into UXPin. And then I'm using UXPin to do exactly kind of what we talked about it doing. As I get it into the lo-fi, I'm clicking through it and saying, well, that doesn't make sense there. We're going to have to change kind of where that sits, on this page, or potentially globally, we're going to have to move that because it's not going to fit here. So, yeah, you have to have an idea before you get into UXPin. At least I like to have one. And then you're using UXPin to validate your hypothesis as to like where things should go. Right.
And let's see here. We have a person named Wolf here who, on a related note, is actually asking a question about UXPin itself. So he's wondering, from your standpoint, how easy or hard is it to model prototypes and interactions in the product? Essentially, I'm guessing this is around both the learning curve and also the capability.
Yeah, it's you can come close. You can usually get very close. It helps. When I first started, it was difficult, but you get better at it. Again, there are certain things where it's just not worth the effort to make it work exactly like it's supposed to. Oftentimes, I'm making judgments on whether I go through with it based on how well the client has been understanding what they're seeing. A good example of that would be, you open up a panel and everything below it moves down. Well, if you have 100 things that need to move down, you need to target 100 things in UXPin and tell them all to move accordingly based on clicking something, and then you have to tell them all to move back when something else is clicked. So is it worth that effort when you could just have it basically overlay the stuff below it and explain it? Some clients, they don't get that and they get frustrated, and we have to make the effort. Others, we just say everything will get pushed down, and they say, okay, I get it. But I would say, it comes down to learning curve. A lot of it. I'm definitely more advanced now, 2 years in, pushing 2 years in, than I was 6 months in. And I think our team is getting to the point now where we can mirror things pretty close to what we want them to be.
Right. And on a related note, somebody was just curious, just related in your experience as a user, what are some like the top things that you have found unique and useful in our product that makes it feel like the right fit for your needs?
It was very it was easy to pick up. It has a good built-in library of things that you can steal from to use. It was a lot of just the learning. I had only really used one other product, but before, when we were making the decision, I reached out to the rest of the members of our team who had used other things, and it was exactly the things that you mentioned earlier, Jerry, about Axure. Some of them got very, some of them did a little too much, and we didn't need, the power that necessarily came with it, that made the application unwieldy to use from our perspective. So we found that we can do most of the things very easily within UXPin, and we've figured out quite a few workarounds. So the better you get with it, the more creative you get at kind of working around some of the stuff that requires some, conditional logic and things.
Right. And let's see here. The next question we've got is, let's see. Okay, so we actually. All right, somebody was curious if they can't run usability testing in their sprint for some reason. What are some ways to still be able to validate those designs in a realistic way when you can't necessarily access the end user?
I suppose it's going to depend on the knowledge that you need to use the product. If it's an internal application that only a certain type of user uses, it's going to be tougher to be able to validate that with just a regular Joe. But send it to a friend, send it to your colleague, have somebody look over your shoulder or sit down at your computer and say, hey, do me a favor, try to do this. And usually you can get some valuable feedback from that. But it does depend, I guess, on the type of product that you're building. But get creative. Shoot it to a friend, shoot it to a colleague, and just say, hey, I'm trying to just figure out if this works. Tell me if you can do this. And if they struggle with it, then you potentially have some valuable feedback.
Right. And I know from our process here, sometimes we will run hallway tests pretty often, but that works well for us because a lot of folks here have a design background, and so if we're building a tool for product teams, designers, PMs, etc., we can test that along those roles internally first as kind of a quick, just gut check. But I get the larger point is we always try to build in user testing anyways, because of course nothing can substitute for the real deal. And let's see, So Mandar has a question about, again, this is going back to your design prototype versus your lower fidelity prototype. So he's wondering, have you ever found any, he calls these sort of like interaction gotchas in the design prototype that maybe were unexpected or surprising? And if so, how do you handle that functionality in the prototype?
Is he able to give you a more specific example?
No, there isn't. I think what he's asking is, when you moved to the design prototype, did you then realize that there was something in the interaction design that was previously unaccounted for? And if so, how is that handled?
No, I can't think of an instance where that's happened off the top of my head. Often the designers, we will send it to the designers and they'll think of maybe a better way to lay it out or a better way to do it that fits with what they've done. So that'll happen. And then of course, sometimes that will change the interaction that you've put into the prototype. But we're somewhat unique as a company in that all of our employees have share roles. So it's usually, hey, I'm thinking of doing this, and then you walk over to the person's desk and you talk it through, and the designers have enough sense of user experience to say, hey, I think this would be a better way of doing this, or I've seen this, and then that just gets that gets baked into the designs. And then if it's a change enough that we think it's going to trip up developers, we'll either note it in the functional prototype to go and see the new design, or we'll note it in the design that the developers need to follow this new method that we're using.
Right, right. And let's see. So an anonymous viewer here is curious about how the design prototype uh, is used to involve product owner and other sponsors. So in this person's situation, they're wondering, how do you manage that balance between time and effort? So in this person's case, their stakeholders don't react very well to wireframes, and so they want something. They want like an interactive prototype when they think that they could solve that problem just by doing a wireframe. So they're wondering, essentially, in your case, do you ever face a challenge where a stakeholder or a client in this case might come and right out of the gate, for instance, they request a hi-fi prototype and you kind of have to talk them down a little bit? I mean, if so, how does that conversation generally go?
So usually it involves showing an example of something that we've done before and explaining to them the process and saying, here is why we do it this way. Here is why we start small and we start lo-fi and then we move towards this. And you try to get them on board with that as best you can. And usually it helps if you put it into terms of dollars and cents and what it does to the timeline and the budget. And they can, though they will probably, they will oftentimes say, okay, I understand. And then there are often other times where they will continue to struggle with it. But the conversation needs to start with, hey, we can't jump into that because here's all the information that we need and here's all the things that we don't know. And if we do that, here is the potential trouble it gets us into later. So what we're going to do is we're going to start here and we're going to move this way. And let's show you an example of how we've done that in the past. So you can show them, here's where we started with these, and then here's where we got as it progressed through the project, and help them understand that just because they're getting gray boxes right now doesn't mean that that's what they're going to wind up with, or that you're completely ignoring the design. It's allowing you to make better business decisions and save time and money and effort along the way. Gary, are you on mute?
Oh, I just realized I went on mute there. Wilson was curious that prior to showing the client the prototype, does the client have a vision of what the design might look like, or is that prototype, even in lo-fi, the first time they encounter and react to that design?
Yeah, it depends. It depends on the timeline. It depends on the project. Sometimes they've seen the designers are working in parallel with us, and they are creating a style tile that is giving them a sense of what they're going to see. Other times that comes after we've shown them a first cut at the prototype. It's part of the reason why we try to keep a certain level of polish on the prototype, only because it's not so lo-fi that they think that that it's that no effort's been put into it, but it's not so hi-fi that they think that it's the actual design itself. So it really does depend on where design fits in, I guess, and how the scope, size, and time frame of it. But we've had projects where that is the first time they're seeing it. Is here's how you're going to get through this, and then the designers will come in afterwards and be like, here's the style tiles, and then we've had it go the other way where, hey, here's the it's more of when we do a branding exercise, and it's, hey, here's where, here's how this is going to look and feel, and then here is the prototype that accompanies that, and they've seen something that is more designed prior to the prototype.
Right, yeah, style tiles you mentioned, that's a very effective way to at least give the client an idea of visually what some of the elements and the themes may be before they see, the actual layouts. And Hardik has a question here. So since you work on these complex products, right, with lots of screens, and I assume requirements sometimes change, how do you try to maintain consistency when you're dealing with dozens or even hundreds of screens in a large complex product?
It's hard. I won't lie to you. You try to do your best to place comments where you can, use UXPin's comments. You use that sidebar, you make notes of it when things have changed. I've gone so far as to make something that's worked for me in the past is to create a toggle to show notes that actually highlight things on the screen. So there's a giant button that says show notes, and it basically redlines things that I need the developers to pay attention to specifically. So, hey, I know that this is like this on this page, but please go see another example on another page. When it gets too unwieldy, I will oftentimes pull a particular piece of functionality out onto its own page, build that there, and then say, to see how this works, go visit this other page, and then build it out there so that they can see how that's functioning. So if something changes that drastically, that's oftentimes the best way to do it. But sometimes you have to get creative, and it's just not worth some of the time that it takes to go back in and maintain these across hundreds of screens. So the theme, I guess, across what I was trying to say today is all about creating that clarity. So however you have to do that, however lo-fi it is, putting something in there that people can see, and getting making sure that they know that this is going to change, and that if they go and visit this other page, they can see that and play around with it on that page. That oftentimes is enough to get people to understand.
Right. Since we are coming up here on the time limit, I wanted to get through one last question here. I'm going to drop in the link to our Slack channel, Product Tribes. So the way Slack has it set up is it has to be invite only. But if you fill out that form, just let me know what email you want to get the invite to. I can send it out to you today. So we will be having some more discussions on Slack, which Nate, of course, is a member of. And right now we've got about 550 members in the Slack channel so far. All of our speakers will be doing just some sort of gradual Q&A stuff in there as members of the community. And the last question here, let's see here. So the last question is actually kind of interesting. this person is wondering, do you feel in your opinion that you get more usable feedback from lo-fi or hi-fi prototypes?
Usually probably the hi-fi, I would say, because there's just more to react to. The lo-fi is really more to get to make sure you're not missing anything and to get people on board with how you're going to flow through the website or the application. So the more useful feedback is usually from the hi-fi with real data and real real life examples of how things are going to work. What you'll get from the lo-fi, and you just kind of have to learn to discard it, is, hey, where's this? I thought we talked about this happening when you do this, and you just have to explain to them, listen, that's coming, but let's just verify. In a way, you're validating what you've done by the fact that they noticed that it was missing. Like, okay, they know that that's there and that needs to be there, but you try to explain to them that that's coming in a future iteration of this. So the usable feedback, I think, comes more from the higher fidelity when there's actually data in there and they can respond to what they would see in real life. Right.
And that concludes our session today. Thank you, everybody, for joining. And thank you, Nate. That was a fantastic presentation, and thanks for answering all those questions. I did just right now drop in the link to the form to fill out to join the Slack channel. So once you fill that out, you'll get your invite, and yeah, we can have more discussions there. Next week, same time, 10 a.m. Pacific, but on Thursday. So this will be, or sorry, my mistake. It's on next Wednesday at 10 a.m. Pacific. We will have Jim Callback, who is the head of customer success at Mural, and he's written 2 books from O'Reilly on UX. He's a pretty well-known designer. He's going to be talking about how to use a strategy blueprint to align folks before sprints and before you dive into the Agile process, so that your design strategy doesn't get lost in sprints and you don't get tunnel vision. So it'll be a pretty hands-on session. He'll walk through the tactic and how you might run it with folks. Hope to see you guys there next week as well. Otherwise, thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we will send out the slides as well as the recording and follow up. We generally send these out by the end of the week or by the early the next week. Yeah, otherwise, hope to see you guys all at the next session. Yeah, thanks again, everybody, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for coming, guys. It's nice talking with y'all.
Yep, take care.
Bye, guys.